My friends and I were exhausted from the routine of the city, the constant noise, the lights that never went out, and the feeling of always being rushed against time. We needed an escape, something that would bring us back to the essentials, to what truly matters. That's when the idea emerged, a camping trip in the forest. No technology, no distractions, just us, nature, and the comforting silence of the trees. We carefully planned every detail, choosing a remote forest far from any signs of civilization. The journey began early, with loaded backpacks and light hearts. The path was long, but our excitement fueled us. We walked along narrow trails, flanked by imposing trees and surrounded by a green canopy that seemed to embrace us. The fresh air filled our lungs, bringing a sense of renewal. After hours of hiking, we found the perfect spot to set up our camp. It was a small clearing, surrounded by dense vegetation that provided privacy and a breathtaking view of the starry sky. We pitched our tents, organized our belongings, and soon we were ready for the first night. Sitting around the campfire, we felt a deep peace. The wood crackled, sending sparks into the air, and the warm orange light illuminated our faces. We laughed heartily, shared fears, and for a moment, forgot about all the problems we had left behind. The forest, with its vastness and mystery, seemed to envelop us in a protective embrace. The sound of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the wind were the perfect soundtrack to our night. The campfire crackled vigorously, sending sparks dancing into the night air, while the flames lit up our faces with a warm, welcoming glow. We felt a profound connection, as if nature were whispering ancient secrets into our ears. We began to share stories, and soon laughter gave way to attentive looks and ears. Noah, always the storyteller of the group, was the first to speak. He told us about an urban legend he heard as a child, a story about a man who mysteriously disappeared in the nearby mountains. As the story unfolded, the sound of the wind in the trees seemed to intensify, adding an extra touch of suspense to the narrative. When Noah finished, there was a moment of silence. We all looked into the dense forest around us, its dark shadows seeming to conceal unfathomable mysteries. It was then that Olivia, in a low, serious voice, began to speak about a personal experience. She recounted a night when she was driving alone on a deserted road and saw a figure in the middle of the road. As she approached, the figure simply vanished. Her eyes were wide as she spoke, and we could feel the tension in her voice. The atmosphere grew even more tense when Jackson, the most skeptical one in the group, decided to recount a time when he and his friends explored an abandoned house. He vividly described the sound of footsteps following them, even when they were alone. His words echoed in the darkness, and every crackle of the campfire seemed like an omen. As the stories continued, I noticed something strange. Occasionally, a distant, almost imperceptible sound mingled with the rustling of the leaves. It was like a whisper, a murmur that seemed to come from the depths of the forest. I didn't say anything, thinking it might just be my imagination, influenced by the spooky tales. As the night progressed, the campfire began to die down, and fatigue started to weigh on us. We decided it was time to retire to our tents. We extinguished the fire, making sure it was completely out, and bid each other good night. I entered my tent with a mix of excitement and unease, my heart still racing from the stories we had shared. On the second night, the atmosphere around our camp had changed. There was something in the air, something we couldn't clearly identify, but that we all felt. The laughter and stories from the previous night were replaced by a heavy, unsettling silence. The campfire was lit again, but this time, the glow of the flames seemed weaker, almost gloomy. We were all sitting around the campfire, trying to recreate the camaraderie of the previous night, but there was a tension we couldn't ignore. That's when we heard it for the first time. A distant sound, coming from the depths of the forest. A sound that resembled a cry, but it wasn't a typical cry. It was distorted, almost like a lament from another dimension, something that made the hairs on the back of our necks stand on end. I looked at my friends, and saw the same look of apprehension on their faces. Noah was the first to speak, his voice low and cautious. Did you hear that?" We all nodded, fear starting to settle in our hearts. We decided to investigate, thinking it might be a wounded animal, or perhaps someone in need of help. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured into the darkness, following the sound of that disturbing cry. The forest at night was a completely different place. The trees, which during the day seemed majestic and protective, now stood like dark sentinels, their shadows creating eerie shapes under the flashlight beams. As we delved deeper into the forest, the cry abruptly stopped. We stood still, trying to hear any other sound, but all we could hear was the rapid beating of our own hearts. That's when we began to hear footsteps. Slow, calculated footsteps that seemed to circle around us, like a predator toying with its prey. Panic gripped us. We ran back to the campsite, our hurried footsteps echoing in the silent night. When we finally arrived, breathless and terrified, we found a scene of destruction. One of the tents was torn, with pieces of fabric strewn across the ground, and our belongings were scattered everywhere. The sense of security we had felt in the clearing had completely vanished. We gathered around the campfire, now extinguished, our faces illuminated only by the dim light of the flashlights. No one could sleep. We spent the rest of the night awake, every little sound in the forest amplified by our growing fear. We felt like we were being watched, that something or someone was closing in on us, waiting for the right moment to strike. When the first ray of sunlight finally appeared on the horizon, we felt relieved, but the relief was short-lived. As we investigated the surroundings of the campsite, we found something that sent chills down our spines. Enormous footprints, unlike those of any known animal, encircled the entire campsite. They were human footprints, but much larger, as if something gigantic had been watching us all night. That second night in the forest showed us that we were dealing with something far beyond our comprehension, something that turned our nature retreat into a nightmare from which we couldn't wake up. The daylight brought a false sense of security, but discovering the huge footprints around our campsite kept us in a constant state of alert. Who, or what, could have left those marks? We tried to rationalize, perhaps an unknown animal, but deep down, we knew something sinister was happening. We spent the day trying to forget what had occurred. We hiked, we fished, we tried to keep our minds occupied. But the tension was palpable. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound made us jump in fear. Whatever was watching us, we had no doubt it would return. As night began to fall, we set up the campfire again, more out of necessity for light and warmth than for any comfort it might bring. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the forest itself was watching us. The silence was overwhelming, and the darkness felt thicker, more oppressive than the night before. As we sat around the campfire, we heard again the sound of the distorted cry. This time, it seemed closer, more urgent. None of us wanted to investigate, but the feeling that we needed to understand what was happening was stronger. With flashlights in hand and hearts racing, we followed the sound through the forest, our footsteps echoing in the deep silence. The cry abruptly stopped, leaving us in absolute darkness and silence. Then, we heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer, clearer. They encircled us, moving erratically. We felt like something was toying with us, testing us. We ran back to the campsite, fear guiding us more than any sense of direction. When we arrived, the scene was even worse than the night before. Not only was one tent torn, but all of them were overturned. Our belongings were strewn across the ground, some completely gone. Clothes, lanterns, food, everything seemed to have been rummaged through and tossed aside. Panic took over. It wasn't just a matter of curiosity or fear of the unknown, but a real sense of imminent danger. We tried to rearrange what we could, but we knew it was futile. Something was hunting us, and we didn't know how to defend ourselves. We spent the night together, huddled near the campfire, trying to stay awake and vigilant. Every sound, every movement around us was a threat. What frightened us the most were the footprints, now more numerous and closer. It seemed like something, or someone, was deliberately trying to terrorize us, making us feel vulnerable. Whatever was out there wasn't just observing us, it was hunting us, taunting us. And with every passing minute, the feeling that we wouldn't leave that forest unscathed became more real and more terrifying. The darkness of the forest seemed more oppressive than ever. We were all sitting close to the campfire, trying to stay awake and alert. No one dared to suggest sleeping. We knew that if we let our guard down, we might not wake up to see the light of day. Minutes dragged on, each feeling like an eternity. Our flashlights were ready, and every snap of a twig made our hearts race. We spoke in whispers, sharing our concerns and trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no sense to be found, only a growing fear. Then we heard it again. The distorted cry, now much closer, echoing among the trees. This time, we didn't move. We froze, waiting, our eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the reach of the flames. The sound seemed to surround us, coming from all directions, sending shivers down our spines. Suddenly, a louder noise, like branches breaking, came from nearby. We illuminated the area with our flashlights, but saw nothing. Just dancing shadows and the dense vegetation of the forest. We sat back down, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The night was far from over. It was past midnight when Noah suggested we take turns keeping watch. We quickly agreed, dividing the night into intervals. I took the first watch, my eyes fixed on the darkness while the others tried to rest. The silence was so deep that my own thoughts seemed too loud. The first part of my shift was relatively calm. The sounds of the forest continued, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. However, when Olivia's turn began, something changed. She was sitting near the campfire, her eyes wide, when she heard a different sound. A sound of something being dragged across the ground. We quickly illuminated the area around the campsite and saw something that chilled us to the bone. On the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by vegetation, was the severed head of a deer. The animal's glazed eyes seemed to stare directly at us, and there was something inscribed on the ground around it. Strange symbols, drawn with what appeared to be blood. Panic took over. We hurried back to the safety of the campfire, our hearts pounding uncontrollably. None of us knew what those symbols meant, but we all understood that it was a warning. Something or someone was sending us a clear message. We were not welcome there. The following hours were a blur of constant vigilance and palpable fear. The sound of the distorted cry persisted, sometimes distant, sometimes so close it seemed to be right beside us. Every second dragged on, the tension mounting with every sound, every movement in the shadows. As the early morning light began to tint the sky, we were exhausted, our bodies and minds on the verge of collapse. But we knew we couldn't stay there any longer. The terror of the previous night had left an indelible mark on us, a certainty that we needed to get out of that forest before it was too late. That sleepless night had revealed not only the horror surrounding us, but also the fragility of our safety and sanity. The clearing, which had initially seemed like a peaceful refuge, was now a stage for living nightmares that we would never forget. When the sun finally began to break the horizon, casting a pale, cold light over the clearing, we knew it was our chance to escape. The terror of the night had left us exhausted, but adrenaline coursed through our veins, urging us to act swiftly. Without exchanging many words, we began dismantling the camp with trembling hands, trying to ignore the deer head that still seemed to watch us with its glazed eyes. Each of us was lost in thought, processing the events of the past nights. There was a silent urgency in our movements, a desperate desire to leave behind that haunted place. The trail back seemed darker, the trees more menacing. We walked in silence, alert to every sound, every movement, fearing that something or someone might be following us. As we moved away from the clearing, we couldn't help but glance back occasionally, half expecting something to emerge from the darkness. But we saw nothing. Only the unsettling feeling of being watched remained with us, like a shadow. The walk back felt endless. Each step seemed to lead us deeper into a labyrinth of fear and anxiety. The silence between us was heavy, laden with the memory of the footprints, the distorted cry, and the deer head. When we finally spotted the edge of the forest, a mix of relief and exhaustion washed over us. But even outside the forest, the weight of what we had experienced didn't leave us. Back in the city, we tried to resume our lives, but forgetting was impossible. Each of us dealt with the trauma in different ways. Personally, I started having recurring nightmares. I dreamed of the forest, of the symbols drawn on the ground, and most often, of that distorted cry. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, feeling like something was in the room with me, watching. Noah delved into research, trying to find some logical explanation for what we had experienced. He spent hours in the library, searching for local legends and stories of mysterious disappearances. But the more he researched, the more questions arose. Nothing seemed to fully explain what we had faced. Olivia, on the other hand, withdrew into herself. She became more reserved, as if she feared that talking about the experience could somehow bring it back. Jackson, the skeptic of the group, began to take an interest in occultism, something I never thought he would do. He believed that the symbols around the deer head held some hidden meaning, something we might be overlooking. As for myself, I couldn't find peace. Each day was a battle against memories, and each night brought new nightmares. I started avoiding places with many trees, the feeling of being watched haunting me wherever I went. The forest, once a symbol of freedom and tranquility, had become a symbol of terror and unsolvable mystery. Whatever was in those trees, whatever left those footprints and scattered our belongings, remains an enigma. We never uncovered the complete truth. The deer head, the distorted cry, the symbols on the ground, all these elements etched into our minds like pieces of a puzzle we could never solve. Even now, as I write this, I feel like something is watching me, that the mystery of the forest is not yet over for us. And I wonder if we will ever find the answers, or if the nightmares and the feeling of being hunted will follow us for the rest of our lives.